Tonight, what we are witnessing across the Eastern Corridor is something no analyst, no intelligence report, no war room projection had anticipated with this level of speed, severity, or sheer destabilizing effect. In the span of just hours, a key defensive line, one Russia spent months constructing, reinforcing, and publicly boasting about, has collapsed in a manner that defies all conventional military logic. Ukrainian forces, who for weeks inched forward yard by painful yard, suddenly found themselves advancing through terrain that, until yesterday, was considered nearly impossible to penetrate. And as we go live on air tonight, the shockwaves of this sudden shift are reverberating through Moscow's command structure, NATO's strategic circles, and every major geopolitical capital around the world. No one fully understands what triggered this collapse, but everyone understands one thing. Something unprecedented is unfolding. Ukrainian units, who had braced for heavy resistance, now describe scenes that feel almost surreal. Bunkers left unlocked, defensive trenches emptied, surveillance towers still running but unmanned, and supply stockpiles abandoned with their engines still warm. Some soldiers are reporting that Russian artillery positions were deserted so abruptly that half-buried shells and firing coordinates remain sitting openly on tablet screens. Others have found radios still tuned to active frequencies, transmitting little more than panicked static. It is not just the retreat itself, it is the speed, the disorder, the unmistakable sense that this was not a controlled pullback, but something far more chaotic, possibly even involuntary. On the Ukrainian side, commanders are simultaneously cautious and astonished. They did not expect a breakthrough like this, certainly not here, not now, and definitely not at this scale. For weeks, they had prepared for grinding resistance, predicting casualties, expecting setbacks. Instead, reconnaissance drones flying overhead show what one officer described as the quietest battlefield I've ever seen in this war. The distant shelling that usually echoes like a constant heartbeat has faded, the smoke plumes that normally paint the horizon have thinned, and the usual chatter of enemy communications has dwindled into a few scattered, frantic transmissions that analysts say feel more like emergency evacuations than battlefield coordination. So what caused this? Why tonight? Why this line? Why would this level of collapse? Those are the questions intelligence communities are racing to answer. Some early theories suggest an internal breakdown, a chain of command fracture so severe that frontline units no longer received coherent orders. Others point to growing dissatisfaction among certain Russian brigades, many of which were reportedly exhausted, undersupplied, or rotated poorly. There are also whispers, unverified but circulating fast, that certain defensive sectors were manned by conscripts who had not been paid in months, who lacked proper equipment, and who may have simply decided this was the end of the road. But perhaps the most alarming theory is the one analysts are avoiding publicly, that something went wrong in Moscow's strategic planning, something deep, structural, and severe enough to create a cascading collapse. Because retreats happen in war, yes, tactical withdrawals happen, elastic defense happens. But a retreat this sudden, this disorganized, covering this much ground in so little time, that suggests something more like a fracture than a maneuver. Inside Russia, panic is beginning to slip through the cracks. Military bloggers usually aligned with state messaging have begun posting unusually critical updates, accusing higher command of blindness, negligence, and total failure. Several have even suggested sabotage, which tells us just how confused and destabilized internal channels currently are. When propaganda voices lose the script, it usually means leadership has lost control of the narrative. And tonight, that loss is becoming visible. Meanwhile, Western intelligence services are scrambling, satellite feeds are being refreshed at rapid intervals, NATO command centers have heightened alert levels, and world leaders are being briefed repeatedly as new reports filter in. The question on everyone's mind isn't just what happened, but what happens next. Because the collapse of a key front line is not the end of a story, it is the start of a cascade. When one defensive layer fails, the pressure on the next increases exponentially. And if Russia can't reconstitute its forces fast enough, this may be one of the most significant shifts in the conflict since the war began. Ukrainian morale, of course, is surging. Soldiers who have been fighting in blood-soaked trenches for months are finally seeing open pathways ahead. But even they express something beyond excitement, something closer to disbelief. Many interviewed tonight said the silence itself feels dangerous. When the enemy disappears this fast, you start wondering what you're walking into. It's a sentiment shared by commanders who are advancing carefully, scanning for traps and anticipating ambushes. Because in war, nothing is ever as simple as it looks. A collapse can be genuine, or it can be bait. And right now, Ukraine's greatest advantage is not momentum, but caution. As this developing situation unfolds, new layers continue to emerge, each more surprising than the last. Some Ukrainian units have reported capturing personal documents left behind, diaries, letters, unfinished reports, all indicating that many Russian soldiers had no idea a major retreat was imminent. Others found maps with hastily drawn arrows, suggesting on-the-spot panic rather than strategic planning. And perhaps most telling of all, several positions were abandoned without the usual destruction procedures. Normally, when a unit retreats, they destroy equipment, burn documents, disable electronics. Tonight, huge volumes of material were left untouched. That speaks volumes, not about strategy, but about shock. Back in Kyiv, officials are maintaining a measured tone. They say they will not count gains until they are secured. They warn citizens against assuming the war is shifting permanently. They acknowledge that Russia remains massively armed and deeply entrenched in many sectors. But even their caution cannot disguise the significance of what has unfolded. Ukraine has not just advanced, it has broken through a wall that was supposed to be unbreakable. Tonight, as we continue monitoring this unprecedented shift, one thing is increasingly clear. Whatever triggered this retreat, whatever internal failure or external pressure caused it, the effects will ripple through diplomatic, military, and political channels for weeks, maybe months to come. Whether this is an isolated collapse or the beginning of something far larger, we are witnessing a turning point, and we will continue tracking it minute by minute. The scale of what unfolded in the early hours of this morning is still coming into focus, and even seasoned analysts are struggling to find the right vocabulary. What Ukraine achieved in the last 24 hours is now being described by Western intelligence sources as one of the most rapid operational breakthroughs of the conflict, a stunning acceleration that has forced Russian units into hurried, disorganized retreat across multiple defensive belts. And as this unprecedented momentum builds, the Rachel Maddow-style breaking news narrative deepens. A frontline once considered frozen has suddenly become fluid, reshaping political calculations in Kyiv, Moscow, Washington, and across Europe. The breakthrough that shouldn't have been possible. For months, the Novigrad-Siversky sector was viewed as an immovable wall, fortifications, trenches, overlapping artillery zones, and dug-in Russian infantry units that analysts believed would take Ukraine weeks, if not months, to break. But when Ukrainian armored brigades surged through two critical junctions before dawn, the line didn't bend. It snapped. Drone footage released later and immediately geolocated by independent monitors showed Russian positions abandoned in haste, helmets left on trench walls, half-packed supply crates, and armored vehicles sitting with engines still warm. One U.S. defense official, speaking anonymously due to the sensitivity of ongoing intelligence operations, described the moment this way. The Russian northern line collapsed in less than 4 hours. That doesn't happen without a major internal failure. Kyiv isn't publicly claiming responsibility for whatever triggered the collapse, but several clues suggest a coordinated combination of electronic warfare, targeted strikes on command nodes, and precise nighttime maneuvering. Whatever the method, it worked spectacularly. Russia scrambles and fails to form a new line. By mid-morning, Russia attempted to form a secondary defensive line along a narrow forested corridor, but Ukrainian mechanized battalions advanced faster than Russian units could regroup. Radio chatter intercepted by Ukrainian signals intelligence reportedly revealed confusion and conflicting orders. One soldier, his voice audibly trembling, transmitted, "We have no artillery support, no guidance. We don't know where the Ukrainians are coming from." Within an hour, that second defensive line disintegrated just as quickly as the first. Russian reinforcements arriving from the rear were forced to reverse course after encountering destroyed bridges and blocked roads, almost certainly the result of Ukrainian sabotage teams working behind the front. A senior European military advisor called it an operational rout, one Russia cannot easily reverse. Ukraine's speed surprises even its own commanders. According to sources close to Ukraine's general staff, the operational plan assumed a 48-hour timetable to secure the first breakthrough alone. Instead, Ukrainian units achieved their objectives in under 10. This unexpected acceleration created a rare problem. Ukrainian commanders had to rapidly adjust logistics, fuel lines, and drone reconnaissance corridors to support troops who were advancing faster than their original battlefield modeling predicted. A Ukrainian officer near the front described the atmosphere. "It felt like everything was moving too quickly to comprehend. Every time we captured one position, we heard the next one was already abandoned. The pace was unreal." Journalists embedded with Ukrainian units reported scenes of soldiers stunned, not by resistance, but by its absence. It was a battlefield where silence was more shocking than gunfire. The political shockwaves begin in Moscow. Even before the Kremlin issued its first brief, tightly controlled statement, signs of political turbulence began to emerge. Russian military bloggers, who often serve as unofficial windows into the Kremlin's battlefield thinking, were in open panic. Several described the retreat as a catastrophe, a humiliation, and a strategic failure that cannot be spun. One prominent blogger, with close ties to Wagner-aligned networks, wrote, "This is the greatest loss of ground since the Kharkiv collapse. Someone in command must answer for this." Within hours, reports surfaced of senior officers being removed from their positions. Russian state television attempted to maintain a calm narrative, but video clips circulating on Telegram suggested internal arguments and visibly rattled presenters. A European intelligence source described Moscow's mood bluntly. "They're terrified for the political fallout. This is the type of defeat that echoes." Washington and NATO react, and the calculations shift. As images of Ukrainian troops hoisting flags over newly liberated checkpoints flashed across global media, Washington issued a cautiously optimistic statement. Pentagon officials emphasized that the Ukrainian advance was still developing and potentially volatile, but acknowledged that the battlefield dynamic had fundamentally changed. Behind closed doors, NATO officials reportedly convened an emergency assessment to determine whether Russia might escalate in response to the rapid collapse. A senior NATO diplomat told reporters, "This kind of sudden shift in territory can trigger unpredictable reactions from Moscow. We're watching closely." Meanwhile, European leaders privately expressed relief, but also concern. A faster-than-expected Ukrainian victory in this sector could force a recalibration of military aid timelines, refugee support, and post-war reconstruction planning. What began as a battlefield breakthrough had now become a geopolitical equation with dozens of moving parts. The human side of the advance. Despite the military drama and political implications, some of the most powerful moments of the day came from newly liberated communities. In one village, residents emerged cautiously from basements, waving makeshift Ukrainian flags fashioned from old cloth. Soldiers distributed water and supplies as elderly residents wept in relief. A Ukrainian medic recalled, "People kept saying they didn't think liberation would ever come. They thought the world had forgotten them." These images quickly spread across social media, generating an emotional wave of support throughout Ukraine and internationally. For a conflict so often defined by stalemate and attrition, these moments injected something rare, genuine hope. The emerging theory: did Russia overestimate its own defenses? Military experts began piecing together what might have caused the Russian collapse. Three possible explanations have emerged. 1. Severed communications. Multiple command posts appear to have been hit in rapid succession, likely leaving frontline units without reliable coordination. 2. Low morale and poor supplies. Several soldiers reportedly surrendered without resistance, suggesting severe shortages and declining morale. 3. Intelligence failure. Russia may have misjudged Ukrainian troop movements, believing the sector too fortified to be targeted. None of these alone explains the entire collapse. Taken together, they paint a picture of a brittle defensive structure crumbling under pressure from a highly coordinated Ukrainian offensive. Rachel Maddow's frame a moment that could define the war. On her primetime broadcast, Rachel Maddow framed the situation in stark terms. This isn't just a tactical gain, it's a turning point. For months, we heard that Ukraine couldn't advance. Now they're moving faster than anyone predicted, and Russia is struggling to respond. We may be watching the most consequential shift of the war in real time. Her message highlighted three key takeaways. Russia's retreat is broader than initially reported. Ukraine's momentum could alter diplomatic negotiations, and the Kremlin may be forced into decisions that escalate or destabilize the conflict further. The message was clear. This is not an isolated breakthrough. It may be the beginning of a new phase in the war. What comes next? As night fell over the battlefield, Ukrainian units fortified their newly gained positions while reconnaissance teams pressed forward toward yet unconfirmed Russian fallback lines. The situation is still fluid, still developing, still capable of changing dramatically. But one fact is no longer in dispute. Ukraine's advance today was faster, deeper, and more strategically disruptive than even optimistic forecasts imagined. Analysts warned that Russia may attempt counterstrikes or redeploy air power to slow the Ukrainian advance. But for now, the initiative unquestionably belongs to Kyiv. The world waits to see whether this momentum will continue into the next phase or whether Russia. We continue tonight with rapidly developing updates from the Eastern Front. Updates that reveal this stunning collapse is not only wider than first understood, but deeper, more chaotic, and far more politically explosive inside Russia than anyone predicted even an hour ago. While Ukrainian forces push forward cautiously, methodically, their reconnaissance teams are reporting discoveries that analysts are calling militarily unprecedented, psychologically destabilizing, and, in some cases, indicative of a force on the edge of structural breakdown. As we come back on air, new intelligence suggests the retreat spans 3 separate Russian sectors, each commanded by different officers, each with different equipment, different logistics, and different levels of experience, yet all collapsing nearly simultaneously. Military experts say it's almost impossible for three independent sectors to fall apart in the same hour unless something catastrophic happened across the entire chain of command. And tonight, whispers from inside Moscow hint at exactly that. For the first time in months, Russian state TV briefly cut into regular programming to announce what they called a temporary repositioning of units for strategic safety. But an online version of that same announcement, posted seconds earlier, contained a different phrase: unexpected withdrawal. That version vanished within minutes, but screenshots are now circulating widely. And as we always say on nights like this, once something appears on the internet, it never truly disappears. Back on the ground, Ukrainian troops entering formerly Russian-held territory describe something that analysts are struggling to categorize. One Ukrainian commander said the entire zone feels like a ghost front, occupied for months but abandoned in minutes. Soldiers entering dugouts found meals still warm. One abandoned armored vehicle was discovered with the engine running, fuel lines attached, and a half-written field report still glowing on a digital screen. It is the kind of disorganized exit that suggests not a normal retreat, but a sudden order, or possibly no order at all. We are learning that multiple Russian radio frequencies carried the same phrase repeated again and again in the minutes before the collapse. Fall back, fall back, fall back. No coordinates, no regrouping point, no structured plan. Just panic. Analysts reviewing the transmissions say the voices ranged from calm to frantic, suggesting different units understood the situation at wildly different levels of clarity or confusion. Some soldiers begged for instructions. Others asked who was issuing the fallback order. In several recordings, no answer came. To understand the scale of this chaos, think about what a retreat normally requires: logistics, communication, protective rear forces, and a path of withdrawal. None of that happened here. The Russian pullback tore through the front like a rip in fabric, sudden and jagged. And a rip this abrupt raises a critical question. What did Russian soldiers think they were running from? That is the question haunting analysts tonight. Some intelligence sources suggest Russian forces misinterpreted drone movements as signs of a large Ukrainian attack, triggering panic. Others believe ammunition shortages reached a tipping point. And then there is the most sensitive theory, one Western officials will not confirm on record, that internal disputes between Russian field commanders erupted into a breakdown so severe it paralyzed the front line. Meanwhile, inside Russia, the political consequences are spiraling. Prominent pro-war commentators, normally loyal to the Kremlin script, are openly criticizing leadership. One influential figure posted a message calling the retreat a betrayal, accusing generals of incompetence and warning that morale among troops is near collapse. Within minutes, the post was deleted. Within an hour, the commentator's account went dark. But by then, the message had spread across dozens of channels and thousands of screens. This kind of public criticism is rare in Russia. This kind is dangerous. And tonight, it is everywhere. Reports from Moscow indicate that several senior officers have been summoned urgently, some for briefings, others for what sources describe as explanations. In authoritarian systems, those two words sound similar, but they mean very different things. One is a meeting, the other is an interrogation. As we track the political aftershocks, let's return to the battlefield, where Ukrainian forces have captured, not destroyed, some of the most valuable hardware Russia left behind. Among the items already confirmed, electronic warfare modules still powered on, encrypted communication devices, air defense interface tablets, high-resolution battlefield mapping systems, fuel depots left untouched, a fully functional armored personnel carrier. These are not scraps. These are the tools Russia depends on to fight and to survive. Losing them is more than a setback. It is an intelligence disaster. One Ukrainian officer told reporters, "This is the most equipment we've ever found abandoned in one place." Another said soldiers were instructed not to touch anything until intelligence specialists arrived. Ukrainian technicians are already analyzing data inside the captured devices, and if even a fraction of that information is intact, the intelligence value may be enormous. Tonight, we are also learning that Russian drone coverage in the area dropped by nearly 70% within hours of the retreat. Typically, Russia floods the sky with surveillance drones, but today, the drone presence evaporated, either because operators abandoned ground stations or because communications were severed. Ukrainian units report flying their own drones more freely tonight than at any point in weeks, pushing deeper, capturing footage showing the same pattern: trenches empty, checkpoints unstaffed, command shelters unlocked. And yet, despite this stunning advance, Ukrainian officials remain cautious. One senior advisor said, "We move with speed, but never with recklessness." They understand that a collapsing enemy is still dangerous. Mines remain, booby traps remain, artillery positioned deeper in Russian territory still holds enormous destructive power, and a force retreating chaotically can sometimes lash out unpredictably. As night falls over the battlefield, infrared drone footage shows Russian convoys moving hastily farther east, headlights off, formation disrupted, spacing inconsistent. One convoy broke apart after what analysts believe was an accident, possibly caused by panic. Another convoy stopped entirely when a vehicle malfunctioned, and instead of repairing it, soldiers reportedly abandoned the vehicle and fled on foot. What we are witnessing is not a tactical regrouping, it is a psychological retreat. Let's talk about the Ukrainian advance itself. Soldiers moving forward in the newly opened corridor describe a landscape scarred by months of war, but unusually quiet tonight. What stands out most is the absence of resistance. For a force that has fought tooth and nail for every meter, this silence is unfamiliar, unnerving. Forward scouts said their greatest fear tonight isn't enemy fire, it's walking into an area that seems too easy, too empty. But commanders insist every step is measured. Drones scan ahead, engineers sweep for mines, recon teams double verify every trench. This is not a reckless charge. It is a disciplined push into territory suddenly, inexplicably open. Meanwhile, Russian state media struggles to contain the narrative. Tonight, 3 different channels offered 3 different explanations: a temporary redeployment, a tactical reorganization, a strategic pause. What they did not offer was evidence, because the images emerging from the battlefield, images now verified by multiple independent sources, show not strategy, not organization, not pause. They show disorder. They show haste. They show fear. And fear has consequences. Western officials are now analyzing whether this retreat marks the beginning of an operational collapse, the kind that can spread like a chain reaction. Wars are often described in terms of weapons, numbers, and terrain, but wars end, or turn, because of morale, panic, communication failures, or leadership breakdown. Tonight, all those forces seem to be converging.
Night has settled across the front line, but the air remains charged with a sense of historic momentum. What began as a sudden breach in Russian defenses has unfolded into something far larger, a strategic shockwave reshaping the war and reverberating across capitals from Kyiv to Washington to Moscow. As emergency floodlights illuminate newly secured Ukrainian positions, the scope of the breakthrough is becoming unmistakably clear. Ukraine has not only reclaimed territory, it has shattered the assumption that this conflict was locked in a static, grinding stalemate. What happened today rewrites the script. Ukraine consolidates, but prepares for what comes next. Ukrainian commanders spent the final hours of the night reinforcing the most vulnerable points of their new territorial gains. Armored vehicles rolled through freshly cleared corridors, engineers detonated mines left behind by retreating Russian units, and reconnaissance teams pushed further into the dark forest line where Russia is expected to attempt its next stand. A senior Ukrainian officer summarized the situation succinctly. "We have momentum, but momentum must be protected. Tonight is about securing every meter we took today." Ukrainian flags were raised over at least 7 liberated villages. In some places, soldiers reported that civilians approached them, crying, handing over critical intelligence about Russian escape routes, hidden ammunition caches, and abandoned defensive tunnels. There is relief, but also caution. Everyone understands that a breakthrough can be a beginning or a trap. The Kremlin enters crisis management mode. Inside Russia, the political fallout is fierce and immediate. The Ministry of Defense issued a short, defensive statement insisting that the retreat was strategic and intended to preserve lives, a claim met with visible skepticism, even on heavily censored Russian platforms. Several high-profile military bloggers, normally cautious to avoid direct criticism, described the day as a humiliation, an operational blackout, and a collapse of the command structure. Rumors are now circulating, unconfirmed but persistent, of planned dismissals within the Russian general staff. A Western intelligence official noted, "When an army loses this much ground this quickly, someone is going to be blamed. The Kremlin cannot afford the appearance of weakness, but appearances may already be slipping." In Washington and NATO, a new strategic question. Officials in Washington and Brussels now face a critical calculation. What does Ukraine do with this new advantage? NATO analysts are examining satellite images to determine whether Russian lines can be reconstituted or whether the collapse signals a deeper structural failure. One diplomat framed it this way: "The question is not just how much Ukraine advanced today, it's what this means for the next 6 months." If today's momentum becomes a trend, the geopolitical landscape of Eastern Europe could shift dramatically and quickly. The moment that may define the war. As Rachel Maddow concluded in her late-night segment, we may look back on this day as the moment everything changed. Not because the war is over, not because the fight ahead will be easy, but because today proved something the world had begun to doubt. Ukraine can still surprise. Russia can still falter, and the story of this war is far from finished. What comes next could determine the shape of Europe for a generation.